Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined as always by my good friend and co-host Mark Etheridge. We're here with an OG type episode. We've had some guests kind of coming in and out, but this one's just
Mm-hmm.
Mark and I, so that's good news or bad news depending on how you view that. And although if you're watching or listening to this, I would hope it's not bad news because what are you doing to yourself if you don't like listening to the two of us talk? That seems like
And why wouldn't you? I mean, come on.
exactly, yeah.
We're just
We
two guys
are.
talking ball.
That's right, exactly. And Mark has that nice syrupy accent, just that gives you the real SEC feel there. So yeah, I don't know what else you'd want, but sometimes people are haters. Mark, what can you say? Today we're going to talk about South Carolina and Florida, two teams that I saw this past week. Mark's been a handful of SEC places this fall. A lot of my SEC specific fall travel was kind of backloaded here, so we're going to talk about a couple of teams that I saw recently. So we're going to jump into that in just a second. But first, I have to let you know that this episode of Highway to Hoover and every episode of Highway to Hoover is brought to you by PitchLogic, the system used by players, coaches, scouts, and instructors at all levels of play, from youth leagues to the big leagues. The easy-to-use and affordable technology makes the platform accessible to every player at every level. All the metrics and features used at the highest level. See pitchlogic.com for more information. All right, Mark, I am officially home from fall travel. My fall has concluded as far as being on the road, and really has concluded for, I think LSU's got some stuff this week, maybe like exhibition type stuff. Shout out to Bill Francis and his emails to keep us updated on that. But for the most part, folks are just about done. And when we sit here, I mean, what are we, Mark? Like 2 weeks from Thanksgiving, believe it or not. So it is that time of year, but just got back from a few different stops, in addition to seeing South Carolina against College of Charleston and Florida against South Florida. I also stopped in Statesboro, Georgia, a place that I'm sure many of our listeners have been through or experienced, and a cool little ballpark down there in Statesboro for Georgia Southern. And it's just a good reminder that Mark and I are in our little bit of an SEC bubble sometimes in terms of what we see and what we experience, and going to a place like Georgia Southern and look, it's not, their ballpark is not a palace like Dudy Noble or anything, but it is a reminder that there's a lot of other schools out there that are invested in baseball in a big way. It's a good facility. They clearly care. It's well kept. They had a pretty good crowd for an exhibition game against USC upstate. So anyway, so if you're kind of in that South Georgia, North Florida area, it's a pretty good little spot. I enjoyed my time in Statesboro. So it was a good trip, an unseasonably warm trip. We had an honest to goodness weather delay in Gainesville. It was, if anything, you could say that it was the perfect tune-up for the spring. We had a rain delay in Gainesville in a game between Florida and USF. It was but we got through it. We got through 14 or 15, I forget how many innings of baseball. Mere child's play compared to the 21 that Mark dealt with a couple of weekends ago at LSU. Let's get into it, Mark. Let's talk South Carolina first, just because that's the order in which I saw them. I'll let you kick it off before I kind of info dump my stuff here. But when you look at what we know about South Carolina to this point, what are your impressions on what you perceive them to be, or questions that you feel like you have about where they are? And then I can maybe tell you a little bit about what I learned with regards to those questions or those presumptions.
Yeah, well, I would say I had probably three primary questions. First off is who's going to replace Cole Messina behind the plate. That's one. The second one would just be, frontline pitching. Who's the ace who's going to be able to match up in this league? There's some really good pitchers this year, and they're going to pitch on Fridays and Saturdays. Who's South Carolina going to try to match them with? And I think the third is overall offensively. This looks to be the strength of the team, certainly offensively. How far can that take them? You got some really, really good returnees coming back, guys who could potentially carry you, but how far? And I think that for me, if we had to pick three, that would be my biggest questions for me.
Yeah, and those are three questions to which I kind of jotted down answers to, because I kind of figured those would be three of them. And we'll start with the catcher question, and the answer to who replaces Cole Messina, of course, is nobody, just
Mm-hmm.
because obviously incredible offensive talent, but also I think kind of in a understated way was also a really good defensive catcher. Like he doesn't
Mm-hmm.
like if you made a list of top defensive catchers around the country, like he probably would not have popped up in those conversations, but he was somewhat quietly, and I think it's one of those things that you only really start to appreciate in after you lose him. And so this fall they're going mostly with Talmadge Lecroy, who
Mm-hmm.
has caught some before, but I emphasize the some. And now part of
Mm-hmm.
that's of course because he's been on the same roster as Cole Messina for a
Right.
lot of that time, but has been mostly an infielder. And I mean, he's a pretty good athlete back there. He's a pretty good mover. He's got a strong arm, but I will tell you, last week against College of Charleston, he he was back there for all 9 innings, and they ran on him pretty much
Regularly.
at
Yeah.
will. And
Mm-hmm.
and Palmineri in post game made a good point. Like some of that was first and third situations. There was at least one. There might have been two, like first and third situations where by design they did not throw through. However, in the one I'm thinking of, the base was stolen regardless. Like even if he had thrown, there was not a chance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of that is also pitchers slow to the plate. And I think, when you have a Cole Messina, you don't have to emphasize the pitchers holding runners as much as you might otherwise. Obviously, they're in a different situation now. So I do think it is a both and as opposed to an either or. That, okay, they're probably not holding runners very well, but I don't think it's just that made it to where College of Charleston felt like they could run almost literally every time they got somebody on first base with no one in front of them. And I was told, I was obviously not there, but I was told at the Air Force scrimmage that it was that they played a couple of weeks prior. It was a pretty similar story. Um, Charleston stole like 6 bases. I think Air Force was maybe five.
Mm-hmm.
And so teams are seeing something they like in that equation. So again, like you're never going to replace a Cole Messina, but they're looking for somebody to at least do the job pretty well. Lecroy, I think, is just the leader in the clubhouse, if you will, because of his
Right.
experience. Max Coffer is also there from Texas A&M. They have a freshman they really like named Gavin Brayland. I think it's Gavin as I look at the roster here, um, I feel like if it's not that I have I was just electrified by what I saw from Talmadge Lecroy, but if it's anybody but Talmadge Lecroy, I don't think that is great news for them in their
Okay.
catching situation. So that I would say that is a big concern going into. If you're going to pinpoint a specific position, I would say catcher is where you'd be most
Mm-hmm.
concerned there going forward to South Carolina.
Okay.
On the mound, it feels a lot like last year, right? Where it's like Eli Jones, the Friday guy, and he's all right. Like he
Mm-hmm.
was pretty competitive most Fridays or Thursdays, as the case is in the SEC sometimes. Um, Obviously, he's not there, but they also don't. They just, as I wrote in my fall report, which is not published yet, but I finished it. Um, what they lack in proven star power, they do have they do make up for a little bit in depth. Now, I say that in part because okay, Dylan Eskew is back. All right, like he
Mm-hmm.
was okay. Roman Kimball is back again, a mixed bag, but he had his moments. He certainly has good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Jarvis Evans from Georgia, same thing. He's had his moments. It's good stuff. They bring him in. They brought in a handful of junior college transfers that I like, one of whom, and Brandon Stone, was a little bit of a draft risk who they got to campus and weren't sure they were going to get to campus. But the big thing is Eli Jersenbeck. He's healthy. His first outing in the fall, which came weeks ago, it's not new news, but first outing in the fall, he was up to 95. Apparently, it's just been full speed ahead in terms of him getting ready. And look, he, in a way that no one else on this roster has that ace feel,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of stuff, in terms of the way it looks, in terms of his delivery, his operation. Like that's ace upside. Now, can he get there? I don't know. We're going to find out. But
Mm-hmm.
he has an upside that nobody else in that pitching staff really has. So, not to put too much on any one person, but I feel like
Right.
he does. There is a lot of weight on him to be a certain thing. So that's my take
Yeah,
on
he's
the
just.
pitching.
I mean, he just really hasn't pitched. He's been
Right.
injured.
Yeah.
So,
But he was,
what about
the
guys
first
like? Yep.
first few
Go
weeks
ahead.
of his freshman year, he was electric. So like
Hmm.
it's not like we haven't seen the flash, if you will.
Hmm.
Go ahead, your question.
I was just thinking guys that pitched some last year who were more midweek, like Copper and Pitzer
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
those guys. Or did they throw when you were there?
Yeah, some of them did, not all of them.
Hmm.
And I'm lumping like Matthew Becker into that, like a
Yeah.
veteran
Right.
guy, but Becker's stuff looked better than I've seen it.
Hmm.
Um, and you look at his ERA last year, I think it's like 6.59 or something, and that's ugly. But he just
Hmm.
strike out 60 in like 42 innings or something like that. So like
Right.
clearly he was doing something right. So guys like it's a little bit of a mixed bag. So Eddie Copper is working his way back from an injury, so
Hmm.
he's throwing bullpens, but is not quite all the way back.
Right.
Pitzer is back and he's throwing well, and he's the kind of guy that is probably, with the way he pitched late in the year, I think someone that maybe has a little more upside than I'm giving him credit for. He was really one of their better guys down the stretch last year, and then as I was writing the fall report, I kind of realized that his numbers were even better than I realized. I mean, the ERA's under 5. He's got 57
Yeah.
strikeouts and 43 and 2/3 innings. I think he's got, if he's your, I would take it as maybe good news if he ends up being like a Saturday starter or really a weekend
Yeah.
guy at all, because he kind of has a lot of those traits you'd look for in somebody to throw on the weekends. The other one I would throw in this group is Parker Marlott, who was also injured last year and is also working his way back, not throwing to live batters, but is throwing bullpens. That's where I say the depth piece comes into play because, okay, you lose Veach, Gainey, Ty Good, Eli Jones, but we've just rattled off a pretty good handful of guys who threw last year and threw some important innings last year, and that's not including Jake McCoy, who started the game against Charleston and has pretty good stuff. Fastball last year was up to 96 with McCoy. So
Okay.
there are a lot of options. If it's not Jerzembeck, I don't know that they have anybody that you feel good about. Hey, we're gonna win 7 of our 10 conference Friday games. Like I don't know that they have that kind of guy if it's not Jerzembeck, but I don't know if this is damning with faint praise. It feels like they're going to win a lot of Sundays with that pitching
Hmm.
staff because they're
Yeah.
just going to have some guys left at the end of the weekend that have some experience maybe that some other teams aren't going to be able to match.
Hmm. So, offensively, I mean, we talked about catcher. What's the infield looking like? I know Petry's played third and first, outfield.
Yeah.
Where does he fit into this? Um, what can you tell me there?
Yeah, I mean that's to me that's like the first piece they have to, I don't say figure out because it's more like
Hmm.
what does our best 9 look like, but you got to, obviously you're going to put Petry somewhere.
Hmm.
Probably right field or first base. The arm plays in right field, but he's not the most elegant outfielder, let's say. So then you've got first base. Um, if he is at first base, I think the rest of the infield kind of looks like Henry Kazmar at shortstop, really good player from Ohio State. I think he's somebody who I've probably overlooked a little too much in terms of impact transfers in the SEC. 2 really good years at Ohio State. Shortstop from day one at Ohio State, which, okay, it's the Big Ten. We like to bag on them sometimes, but like it's Ohio State, and he was a freshman shortstop. That's not nothing. Good offensive player, not electric in terms of athleticism, but a good runner, a good mover, plays a solid shortstop. I think South Carolina fans are going to be happy with him there. Then a couple of exciting guys at second and third, at least based on what I've seen so far. The second baseman I think most likely is Caden Gaskin, who's a JUCO
Hmm.
transfer from Georgia. He played at Northwest Florida State College, I think. I mean, the guy's like a plus plus runner, like just a blur of a human being who hit 400 something at the junior college level and has a little more pop than you would think. Not a very big guy, but has a little more
Hmm.
pop than you would expect based on that. So if he gets on base, and obviously that's the biggest question when we talk about JC guys moving up to the SEC, do you hit enough or get on base enough to make your speed work for
Right.
you? If he does, it's a real problem for the opposition. Really, really
Mhm.
electric athlete. The leader at third base, I think, right now is KJ Scobie, a freshman, who's, like a 6'2", 195. Like, he's not a small guy, but his body's like, oh, you put 20 more pounds on him and he's going to be kind of a physical monster.
Mhm.
Plenty of power already, but he's kind of got a flat swing. So he doesn't really elevate yet. It feels like that's still to come, like learning how to
Yeah.
elevate the ball without losing the bat to ball, because he's a very good bat to ball guy. So I think he'll hit somewhere in the middle-ish part of the order,
Hmm.
5, 6, 7, something like that. Makes a lot of good contact, hits the ball hard. Again, the power just not there quite yet.
Mhm.
In the outfield, you've got a lot of good options. Blake Jackson is back.
Mhm.
Obviously, he's not going to be a guy that's going to hit 20 bombs probably, but like, good on
Yeah,
base
it's a
guy,
good
has
SEC
some,
player. Yeah.
yeah, solid SEC player, good runner, gets on base, has some pop. The walk-off home run against Kentucky is a big memory
Mhm.
from last year. Dalton Mayshore, a transfer from St. Mary's, kind of a similar player to Blake Jackson, frankly. He hit for some power at St.
Mhm.
Mary's. I'm not sure that necessarily translates over. Nathan Hall is a transfer from Clemson who can really run. Like, he's going to be in the mix in the outfield. So uh, Kennedy Jones obviously is the big name there, and he feels like a
Mhm.
guy that, look, if this team is going to be really good, it
Yeah.
feels like he's going to need to not be Ethan Petry, but start to
Mhm.
exist in that space, because the raw power
Yeah.
is there. He just didn't hit with a ton of it against SEC pitching. Is that just who he is? Or is there something to be said for a bump in his second year? Palmineri thinks so. Palmineri was very bullish on him in our post game chat last Thursday. I'll wait and see on that. Um, I'm not doubting it necessarily, but I think it's easier said than done thing to transform who you are as a player in the SEC from one year to the next. So we'll just have to see. But I would take it as very good news for South Carolina if it turns out Kennedy Jones is kind of an all conference maybe type of, at least in that conversation in the SEC next spring.
Right. Well, one question on South Carolina is, under Mark Kingston, the former coach, they would have, really good years and then follow it up with not as productive a year. What have you seen from Paul through the fall, Paul Maneri, that can, I don't know, provides more consistency, perhaps? I guess that was the kind of the downfall of the last regime. Um, and certainly he's had a lot of success everywhere he's been. Anything stood out, just the difference, in the programs.
Yeah, and not being there every day, like, for
Hmm.
folks like you and I, it's a little bit harder to tell, but I think you and I both know that part of that is just, I think, going to come from Paul Maneri's demeanor. Like, he's an extremely understated guy, obviously an extremely bright baseball guy, more of a fiery competitor than you would think based on his demeanor, but he's a pretty even keeled guy. He's big on, um, he's big on getting to know his players. He's big on challenging them in kind of an understated way that
Hmm.
doesn't come off as fire and brimstone, if you will. I think that's part of it, and I think they're set up well for that, because the reality is they didn't really lose. I mean, okay, Connor McCreary goes to Texas and he has a pretty good arm, but Ethan Petry didn't even really
Hmm.
seem to entertain the idea of leaving even before they hired Palmineri. But Palmineri comes in, and not only do they keep the roster together, but they add to it through the portal. And so from year to year, I think we will see from 2024 to 2025 a pretty good level of consistency. There might be a cap on the ceiling for this team, but I have a hard time imagining the floor
Yeah.
falling out like it did sometimes in the Kingston era, where it was like this roller coaster of, you know, really exciting years where you thought
Hmm.
it could be an Omaha team, followed by teams that were like more in the battle to get to Hoover than they were in the battle to get to Omaha. So with that roster continuity, which is rare
Hmm.
in this day and age when you change coaches, keeping Monty Lee, by the way, probably a big part of that. Um, that level of continuity is rare, but I do think it's going to create a situation where I think what this team did last year is kind of I don't want to say the total floor on that, because anytime you lose the pitchers they did, anytime you lose Cole Messina, that's
Hmm.
a tough thing to do. But it seems like that is in the realm of where their floor is, as opposed to a complete starting over, which if that were the case, like this might be a team that would have been in for a tough year. But because of the continuity, I don't think that's in the cards.
Yeah, well, anytime you have a coaching change, you always wonder if what it's going to look like in year one. So, I mean, just
Yeah.
basically from what from your look, it looks like South Carolina is at least going to be in that regional bubble mix, at a minimum, right?
Yeah, I'd
So,
be shocked if they're just not competitive in that
and
realm.
right, okay. So, anything else on South Carolina that caught your eye, either from your visit there, or just things that you pick up, talking to people while you're there?
I think there's just a lot of question about what exactly. I think there's a lot of feeling similar to what I'm expressing, that, I think there's a floor here that we can expect the team won't fall below. But at the same time, I think there's just a lot of question of, okay, if this team is going to, be a team that maybe surprised us a little and maybe they're in the mix to host in the end, there's a hard time, which is not to
Hmm.
say it can't happen, but there seems to be a hard time imagining what that looks like, right? Just because you look at the lack of
Yeah.
proven stars in the mound, you look at the lineup outside of Petry, and I think we're just having a lack of imagination of figuring out what that's going to look like if they're really good. Which again is not to say they can't be, but I got asked a ton while I was out there by people whose opinions I would value on this question, of just asking me like, what do you think about this team?
Hmm.
Like, what's your take on it? And it's like, well, I was going to ask you the same thing. So, I think there's just kind of a collective
Right.
uncertainty about
And,
what it's going to look like. I was actually a little bit happy to see that there doesn't seem to be as much cynicism maybe about Pulmonary. I know there was I
mhm,
think we were kind of all caught by
yeah.
surprise that that's the way South Carolina went, or that Maneri was even interested. And you and I have talked about this. Like,
Hmm.
I felt like there was too much negativity about the hire. I get why it's unconventional. I get why there are maybe some concerns here or there, but like the dude won a national title at LSU, and like he
Yeah.
brought Dylan Cruz to LSU. Like he was the recruiting coach on that. Dylan Cruz played for Paul Maneri.
Mhm.
So like he clearly had not lost the ability to bring in high level players
Mhm.
and get these guys to campus. So I just thought there was a little bit of an overreaction of, what are we doing? This is crazy with Pulmonary. Like, is it a 15-year solution? No, but that going in. But the idea that he's just
Yeah.
can't do this job anymore, I've always thought was crazy. And I was happy to see that maybe it's just that people have kind of gotten over the shock of the hire. There didn't seem to be a lot of cynicism or negativity about it around those I talked to, which I found refreshing.
Yeah. I mean, South Carolina is one of those teams for me that I just don't have a great handle on heading into the season. What you want to get? I mean, it's South Carolina, it's Kentucky, it's Ole Miss, Missouri. I mean, teams that are going to look a lot different personnel wise in many areas. Um, and a lot of the new players we don't know a ton about. So I think that's going to be fascinating because you got that many teams. And Oklahoma, you could add to that mix uh, as a team, but you don't really know what you're going to get. So Joe, you got a long look at Florida the other day. There's a few things I'm really curious about with the Gators. One, there's so many options on the mound. Really interested to hear, how you think that's going to shake out because there's no shortage of candidates. And let's talk pitching first, and then certainly have a lot of questions about the lineup.
Yeah, the pitching is interesting. I had it in my head that, okay, there's some pieces here that Florida is going to be looking to replace on the
Hmm.
mound, and so I have some questions there. And then I looked at it again, and like that's true in some regards, right? There's Brandon Neely was kind of a one of one guy in terms of what he brought to the table.
Yeah.
Totally a guy that you're going to want to replace. Fisher Jameson had a really nice year, like that's a guy to replace. But
Hmm.
Cags had his moments, and he was pretty good last year. But you also knew that came with
Yeah.
some risk with him, right? And so, and then
Yeah.
obviously the Cade Fisher thing last year didn't really work, so he's off to Auburn, but you didn't really have him last year, right? In a way that you anticipated having. So there's really not as much overhaul here as I expected. And one thing that struck me as I watched these guys against South Florida was that they are as to me, they are as talented as they were on the mound last year, but it's more polished this year, I would say.
You're
Because
older,
last year
a lot of these guys. Yeah.
exactly. And it's like, okay, you don't have Cags anymore, which of course you'd like to have him, but you don't have this guy who's just very oftentimes boom or bust on the mound. And then
Mm-hmm.
so last year it was okay, we've got Cags, we've got Cade Fisher moving from bullpen to starter. How's that going to go? Um, we have Brandon Neely, who we're trying to move from the bullpen to starter. How's that going to go? And ended up coming around to the right spot for him. But this year, it's just they've seemed very assured of what they have and what it's going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
It's Liam Peterson trying to pick up where he left off. They've cleaned up his mechanics a little bit to where there's like
Mm-hmm.
a few fewer moving parts, and he looked. I mean, it's one small look, but he looked awesome in the outing against South Florida. You've got Jake Clemente coming off of a really really good summer
Mm-hmm.
in the Cape Cod League. You're bringing back
He's going to be a weekend guy, right? You think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think you start with Liam Peterson and Jake Clemente, and then you go from there. And you're talking about folks like Luke McNeely. Do we try that again? Do we do
Mm-hmm.
Pierce Coppola, who showed some
Mm-hmm.
things late last year, but the reality of Pierce Coppola is that it was 8 starts last year, and the first few were only a couple of innings. So, what does he look like with a bigger workload? But so he's kind of in the mix there. So I say that to say the stuff has not dropped off, and yet I feel much better about this Florida pitching staff in terms of, I guess a better way to put it is the ceiling is just as high, but the floor has been raised because you're not
Mm-hmm.
like, look, they've got talented freshmen on this staff that we're going to see pitch and pitch well, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not like last year where it's like, okay, yeah, we're like we've got all of these freshmen and a bunch of them are going to have to do something. you know, um, the freshmen to me kind of seem like um, the garnish on the dish as opposed to as part of the main course, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
and look, and we can get into some of the specifics of it. Josh Reitnauer is a guy who pitched really well in my look. Jackson Barbary is a guy I've heard a lot of good stuff about. Unfortunately, didn't get to see him because he was warming up to come in when there was some rain and there was a delay of about 40 minutes, and so they just ended up just not getting him hot again. So I didn't get to see him, but Nico
Mm-hmm.
Jansen is a lefty that's going to have a role. So like we can go on and on with these freshman arms, but whether or not
Aiden
Florida, the
King.
best
Yeah.
the best one I saw is Aiden King. Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Aiden King, maybe the two best innings in the USF exhibition. So whether or not Florida reaches its potential, I don't know that the freshman pitchers are going to have to be a big part of that for that to happen. Now, is it more likely if they're a big part of it? Probably,
Mm-hmm.
because that means they lived up to the moment. But I don't know that it has to happen for this Florida team to be as good as we think they can be. And I think that's a little bit of a departure from last year when it just looked as good as we felt about Liam Peterson. There was always the understanding of, boy, that's a lot of stock they seem to be putting into this freshman, right?
Yeah.
So I like where they're at on the mound more this year than I did last year. And we were pretty bullish last year, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. So offensively, there are quite a few guys back. I mean, you're looking at Ty Evans and Donay and Shelton and Curlin and Heyman. Then after that, one, what did you see from those guys? To, are they going to make a jump? Or any of them, going to make the jump? Because while all of them did some things, none of them really had the years that we were expecting from them heading into the season. And then who are the peripheral guys, either added through the portal or just program guys who are, who continue to develop?
Yeah, I think because you lose Cags offensively, understanding that you're never going, much like Cole Messina, South Carolina, you're never going to replace Cags from a production standpoint in the lineup. You're going to need multiple pieces to make that up collectively. I don't know that I can confidently say which place it's going to come from, but I think if you take the group of Kurland, Shelton, Heyman, Donay, you need one of those guys or two of those guys collectively to be first team all SEC types of guys to help make up for that. Because you look at the stats from last year, and I had forgotten this because, look, they got to Omaha, and it was a pretty good run the second half of the year. But you look at the stat sheet, and it becomes pretty clear how CAG-centric their lineup was at times last year, where I get the batting averages and everything, but he's 100 points better than anybody else for Florida last year. So like
And
you do
150 more than most of them. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, from
Yeah.
Cags to Tyler Shelnut is, yeah, I mean, 150 plus points. So
Mm-hmm.
you're just going to need steps forward there. And I think part of how this comes to pass is actually on the defensive end, because I do think they have a lot of stuff to settle there, where Luke Heyman is probably the everyday catcher. So then what do you do with Donay? Like, do you just do first base full time? Do you put him in the outfield? Do you do what you did last year with him, which is he plays a little bit kind of everywhere, and he
Mm-hmm.
ends up being a full time player at a kind of a mishmash of positions.
Yeah.
Is Ty Evans is a really good athlete, but is he the everyday right fielder again? I think the answer is yes there, but there's a worry on a couple of things there. Is that one, he's a very good athlete, has a very good arm, very good runner, not always the most intuitive outfielder, and he plays so hard that sometimes you're afraid he's going to hurt himself, which was the case last
Yeah.
year. So there are concerns there. So I think how that defensive piece plays out, I think maybe has a lot to do with who we look at here. I think the obvious thing is that it's hard to nitpick a season in which a guy hits 20 home runs in the SEC, but I think with Colby Shelton, I'm looking at him as someone, okay, you're in year 2 of being a shortstop. We know you can do it. So you don't have to worry about that, like figuring out how to do that piece of it. Is he just
Mm-hmm.
more settled now? Is he
Yeah.
more comfortable? Uh, and can he now just, instead of being Colby Shelton, the big name transfer who's going to be Cags's right-hand man in the lineup, can he just be Colby Shelton and, in his best version of himself? I think that can be a powerful thing, that he can look around and be like, all right, I've got help in this lineup. I'm just Colby Shelton. I'm going to be the best Colby Shelton I can be. And does that help him?
Yeah.
Now,
He lost so much weight. He looked, and he really played a good shortstop last year. I mean, he blew us all away. We didn't expect a whole lot, and he gave us a really solid defensive effort there. And he still hit for power, but he didn't hit for average, and it was a lot of just plate discipline. Just from being down there, I mean, what do you see there? Can he be a guy? I mean, he hit 254. They need more than that from him, just from an on base percentage standpoint. I mean, he was 374 on base percentage. They need more than that from him. So
yeah.
what do you see there offensively? Because he sort of proved his worth against all of us doubters last year at shortstop. What about at the plate?
Yeah, well, and I think those two things go hand in hand, because you more eloquently kind of illustrated the point I'm making, which is
Mm-hmm.
last year was a big part of him being a shortstop that he lost a bunch of weight. And I'm not saying that's the reason
Mm-hmm.
why he didn't hit as well as he did the year before, but like it was clear a big
Yeah.
focus for him was I need to transform my body, and I need to be lighter. I need to be more agile. I need to be more mobile. And when you're
Mm-hmm.
doing that, it does make it a little bit hard to really, do other big transformative things. So he was
Mm-hmm.
always somebody who swung and missed a decent bit.
All right.
The freshman year at Alabama, he was prone to that too. It's not like his freshman year at Alabama, he hit 360. Right? I think he
Right.
ended up hitting 290 or something like that, which is solid, but he had strikeouts. He wasn't always like the best bat to ball guy. So now maybe that he's proven himself at shortstop and he's not looking over his shoulder. He's not trying to prove to people he can do that. Can he embark on some bigger changes in his swing or his approach? Whether to bring back some of that power to where he's a 30 plus home run guy, because that's in there, or just
Mm-hmm.
to be somebody who is a little more consistent in terms of not striking out 82 times, someone who works the count a little bit better, someone who's not as aggressive in his swinging. So I think um, I think that'll be I think that'll be helpful in doing so. Is just less focus
Right.
on one thing, more focus on another, and that's part of just him being himself. And I think some of the other parts of it are just that yes, the biggest bat in the lineup from last year is gone, but the guys they brought in I think are going to be helpful in this regard. Kyle Jones looks to me,
Okay.
the Stetson transfer, like a superstar. I mean, the guy's a true center fielder. He runs really well. He's got more power than you think. I mean, first at bat of the game against South Florida, he yanks just a rocket of a home run onto the berm in left field that kind of elicited a response out of the press box where we were like, man, that's hit hard. And then all of a sudden it just left the park.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, oh, okay. It just carried. So,
Yeah.
and I talked to him in post game and stood next to him, and he's a pretty big guy. Like, he's a good
Yeah.
runner, center fielder, but not a small frame guy. Like, he's pretty strong guy. So I think he's got superstar written all over him. I think Blake Sear has some of that same stuff if he can stay healthy and recreate his freshman year at
Yeah.
Miami. And I think they're in a good spot where someone like Landon Stripling from Texas Tech, who can really hit, and there's
Right.
questions more about where he fits defensively, like for him to just be a DH type guy. And I think that speaks to what they think about the rest of their offense and their lineup pieces, that he almost feels like an extra piece to the puzzle rather than being, someone who's going to be the linchpin to all of it. So I say all that to kind of circle. And I didn't mention Bobby Boser, by the way, of course, South Florida transfer, who is like a little bit of a Swiss Army knife who can do a lot of things well. He's not the most consistent guy. If you look at his USF stats, there's a year where he hits for more power. There's a year where he hits for more average. There's a year where he runs a little more. If you could put all those
Mm-hmm.
things together, we'd have a pretty complete player. Of course, if he'd put all those things together before, he'd now be in pro baseball, not at Florida.
Mm-hmm.
So, there is that element to it. But so I think it's two part with someone like Colby Shelton, where you wonder how he does now that he's the guy, but I do think there are enough pieces around him now where I don't know that it's going to feel like that necessarily. I think we look at him as this is the guy who the lineup is going to center around, but I don't know if in actuality that's the way it's going to feel, because there is a not just in terms of star power, but there's a pretty good diversity of skill here in this lineup, and maybe even some more athleticism than what they've had. So maybe they run a little more, maybe they make things happen a little more, and maybe that's helpful for their lineup.
Yeah. I mean, the big question for me is, are they going to score enough? I think with Shelton, you've got a guy who could give you a lot of pop. I mean, Heyman could do it as well. It's just, are they going to be deep enough in the lineup with quality, and are they going to be able to match up with some of these behemoth offenses that can show up from week to week in this league? That's my biggest question for the Gators. I think they're going to pitch.
I agree, and it's a good reminder. I look at some of the big names they had in the lineup last year, and I look at some of the big names that are back, and then I have to kind of remind myself that frankly that the lineup wasn't good for a lot of last year. It was a step back for Colby Shelton. It was a step back for Cade Kurland. It was, Ty Evans had a nice year, but he spent some of it injured again, right? It was to the point where, let us not forget, it was to the point where you could argue the most important player, like in the regional round, was Ashton Wilson, who didn't play at
hot.
all. Yeah. And he's a very, not like he'll have a role to play this year too. Athletic guy, can play a bunch of positions, has some pop. Like, he does a lot of things well. It's not a slight to Ashton Wilson, but if they knew that was in there, they would have played him a lot earlier in the season, right? So they run him out there kind of in a pinch, and he was great.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen if they don't have a situation where they're like, we need something here. Like, injuries were part of it too, but it's just like they were at a point where they needed him to be what he was. They probably, frankly, don't get to Omaha without what he did late last season. So it is a little bit of a reminder that the lineup last year just wasn't very good. It was very Cags centric. Nobody else in the lineup hit more than double-digit home runs in SEC play other than Jack Caglianone. So
Right.
So when you said that I think they're going to pitch, I just wonder if they're going to hit enough. My initial response was, oh, interesting. Like, I don't know that I agree. But then I think about it and I'm like, no, you're right. Because I think it's perfectly within the realm of possibility that all of these guys are better next year. Kurland, Shelton, Dene, Heyman,
Mm-hmm.
whoever. But on the other hand, it's just as likely that they're not, right? And the most likely scenario is that some of them do, some of them don't get better. And then what are you left with at that point? Is it a average offense? Is it an above average offense? Is it a well above average offense? And the answer to that question is probably going to determine, is this a national title team? Or is this kind of like
Right.
last year where it was a team, do they get hot at the right time and get to the biggest stage? But maybe they were always kind of an incomplete team ultimately in the end, you know?
Yeah. I think that's my biggest question for them is we had such high expectations for Heyman and Curlin last year. And, they were just okay. If they can reach where we wanted them to be last year, where we expected them to be, and they can do that this year, then yeah, this lineup looks, it answers a lot of the questions, right? So I do think that it's going to be a good team. It's going to be one of the top 5 or 6 in the SEC, which puts you in the top 10 in the country. So it's certainly heading into the year that, they're right where they want to be. Anything we didn't touch on from a Florida standpoint?
I do think I alluded to it, but I do want to reiterate that this is not going to be a team outside of a couple of positions, right? Colby Shelton at shortstop. I think Heyman at catcher is one of them. Kyle Jones in center, if I had to guess. Maybe Kurland at second. But I think at positions like first base and third base and the corner outfield spots, and somebody else is going to have to catch. No catcher, very few anyway, catch 56 plus a postseason. There are going to be some defensive questions here in terms of how you align it. And then as a knock-on effect of that, how well do you play defense?
Mm-hmm.
And so that is, I don't want to say necessarily a question, because I do think there are some premier defenders mixed in there. But on the margins, when you're talking about this being a top 10 team, like, things on the margins matter. And if this is an average defensive team, a below average or an above average defensive team, I think can make a difference. And with guys like Done, who are kind of positionless, Stripling, that's kind of positionless, Blake Sear, that is a good athlete and plays multiple positions, but hasn't really proven that he can play any of them at an above average level necessarily over a full season. It does make me wonder, like, I think this could be 56 games, 56 lineups type of deal, which shows that they trust a lot of different guys, but also might suggest that they're not totally convicted at a couple of different positions. So something to watch over the course of the entire spring. All right, that feels like an episode there. Mark and I talking South Carolina and Florida based on my looks at those two teams last week. Some exciting episodes coming up. We have some more guests coming up. We don't have those quite squared away just yet, so I don't want to get over our skis here and promise some things on some specific dates that we can't necessarily promise, but we do have some of those episodes coming up. Some different stuff. Mark and I will have some maybe look aheads at some schedules. Most teams have their schedules out now, so we can start to kind of dream on some of those non-conference matchups that we haven't talked about. We'll probably have some episodes that do some wrapping up of things like our big picture fall thoughts, talk about some teams we didn't talk about because we didn't see them, maybe some teams that other folks at D1 Baseball saw. We'll have some of that. We've got interview episodes we're still working on. So we're going to bring like a full buffet of things here over the next 2 months, because don't look now. I mean, like, we're really pretty much 8 weeks away from being in season preview mode. So that stuff's going to start coming down the pike pretty quickly here. So we've got all of that ahead, and Mark and I are excited to bring it to you. So that's going to do it for this edition of Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. Thank you to Pitch Logic for sponsoring this and every episode of the Highway to Hoover podcast. Thank you to Mark, as always, for joining me, and thank you, the listener, for listening. We'll talk to y'all soon.